A policeman's hand landed on his cheek like a punctuation mark. Loud, public, irreversible. The crowd gasped. Phones lifted. Somewhere in the station a radio hissed. For a man the world called Joker, the slap was not humiliation so much as an ignition, the kind of small violence that detonates entire histories. He smiled afterwards. Not the joke anyone expected, but the kind of smile that weighed years and choices. In that instant, the city split into two truths: the official story the uniform wanted to tell, and the one the man in paint would write with fire and precision. What follows is not a punchline. It's a reckoning.
If you want the rest, the betrayals, the clever traps, and the twist that flips guilt and justice inside out, subscribe now and hit the notification bell.
The slap cracked like a verdict. For a second, the entire station existed only in the echo of flesh against painted skin, a sound that seemed too small for what it would set into motion. People stared as if witnessing a private thing made public. Shame, anger, the sudden exposure of a history between two strangers that neither of them would be allowed to forget. The officer's jaw tightened. A dozen cameras caught the tremor in his hand. Joker did not flinch. He turned his head, let the bruise bloom beneath white paint, and smiled with a softness that made the smile worse. "You don't know what you just started," he said, low enough for only the closest to hear. The words should have been a bluff. They weren't. They were a roadmap. They cuffed him because protocol demanded it. To remove the spectacle, to restore order. The corridor smelled of bleach and cheap coffee, a smell that in the dark of the city had once been comfort. Now, it felt like the scent of a place that had chosen to forget. As they led him past the rows of lockers, officers who had earlier cheered on their colleague shifted their eyes away. Cameras still rolled, phones still found faces. Every image would travel. Every second had been rehearsed, or rather, it had been invited to happen. In the holding cell, Joker sat with his palms folded, the handcuffs a cold punctuation between him and the world. He listened. The city outside the bars was a constant hum of indifference and small cruelties. Inside, the station was a different beast. Gossip, paper trails, the soft clack of keyboards where secrets were cataloged and buried. He had come prepared for this room because he understood where people kept their lies, not under lock and key, but in the places they thought no one paid attention to. Across the hall, in a stairwell that smelled of old smoke, Detective Mara Quinn watched everything on a small, cracked tablet. Mara was not impressed by theatrics. She was the kind of cop who believed in lists and timelines. She kept her desk like a surgeon kept her tools. When she saw the slap video floating around the squad chat, she expected a PR nightmare. What she did not expect was the way the precinct reacted. The sudden, awkward silence. The quick refolding of shoulders as if someone had said the wrong word in prayer. She knew Joker's face, not the painted mask the city screamed about, but the man beneath it whom she had once seen at a cordoned-off crime scene, standing too close to a victim and speaking like they were old friends. The memory tasted like a coin in her mouth, cold, metallic, impossible to spend. There had been rumors about Joker's past, that he'd been a counselor, that he'd lost a child to a system that had promised protection and delivered indifference. She had never believed gossip until she found herself tracing the edges of those stories for any thread that might matter. Did he provoke it? One rookie muttered at the doorway. The answer everyone wanted was simple, yes or no. The truth was ugly. There had been calculations behind that smile. The way Joker had chosen the desk near the CCTV, the specific officer whose hands had landed on him. It was not an accident. It was a lever. Inside the cell, Joker opened his mouth and let a softer voice out, meant for cameras and for the human ears who still noticed. "You should have asked why I came here," he told the empty air. "You should have asked who benefited from silence." There was a clarity to his anger that made it almost religious. Not pious, but convinced. He spoke of ledgers and late-night calls, of evidence moved to dead files, of a name that kept surfacing in complaints with no follow-through. Roland Harrow, precinct captain, A man who smiled at ribbon cuttings and made problems disappear. When Mara slipped into the corridor to check the comms logs, the world tilted. She moved like someone who knew the consequences of seeing too much. The files on her screen were not deleted. They were meshed into a private drive. Timestamps edited, complaints stamped resolved without follow-up. The pattern was sloppy enough to be confident, but delicate enough to be dangerous. Someone inside the force had been orchestrating disappearances of truth with the same care they gave to pensions.
Joker heard the clack of Mara's shoes and called, "Detective!" He had an effect on people. He had learned how to use it like a compass. "You look like someone who reads reports like prayers. Will you read me one?" Mara hesitated, and then, because she was tired of small lies, sat. She wanted to know why a man with painted grief would risk everything to be slapped in public. He told her, not pleading, not boasting, only the cadence of someone who had counted the cost. "My sister ended up on one of those lists," he said. A complaint, then silence. "She went to the hospital twice, then she stopped going. The next time I saw the paperwork, they'd written, 'No further action.' She's dead." They put a number next to her name and called it closure. The cell seemed to inhale. You could measure the humidity of a room by how it took in a story. "And you think Captain Harrow did this?" Mara asked. Not because she doubted, but because she needed a scaffold for what came next. Joker's smile widened and became a map. "No," he said. "I know." He reached into his coat and, after a beat that felt like the wobble before a storm, produced a stack of printed emails, a thumb drive, a tiny envelope containing a hotel receipt with a name and a time. He slid them toward Mara through the bars as if he were offering her a confession or a bomb. She picked them up with shaking fingers. The handwriting on the receipt matched a captain's signature she had seen at a promotion ceremony. The emails were damning in their mundanity, a pattern of favors, threats veiled as memos, transfers arranged with the kind of bureaucratic cruelty that could kill. "Why the slap?" she asked, because understanding the method mattered. "Because sometimes the station needs to be shown it bleeds," Joker said. "It's one thing to whisper, it's another to have the wound filmed. People ignore whispers. They retweet a wound." He tapped the bruise on his cheek. Mara's phone buzzed. A new message thread had appeared in the internal channel with a clip attached. The station's surveillance system showing movement in the evidence room late last night. The timestamp was odd. The footage had been shortened, but enough remained to make the stomach of any honest officer tighten. Someone had opened the tamper-proof locker at 2:13 a.m. The last person with clearance to do that was Captain Harrow. Mara looked at Joker. "This would break him," she said. Joker's grin narrowed until it was almost approval and something like sorrow. "It will," he said, "unless he breaks the whole place first." They heard shouting from the squad room, Harrow's voice, booming and incredulous, the sort of voice that never expected to be questioned. The corridor doors swung open and officers clustered, phones in their hands, faces lit by accusation and the knowledge that a story had reached a point of no return. Then, as if a hand had tripped a wire, the screens in the station flickered and went dark. For 3 long seconds, the only light was Joker's painted face in the dim emergency glow, and for 3 long seconds, no one in that station knew whether the next moment would be confession or carnage. When the lights returned, something else had already started. A recorded voice playing over every speaker in the precinct, a voice that belonged to someone who knew how to tell a country's truth in 40 seconds and make it impossible to forget. "Everyone listens now," the speaker said. "Decide what you want to be when you hear the names." The recorded voice was calm, almost bored, and because it sounded like a whisper, it cut through the noise harder than any shout. "Names. You all know them. You've been paid to forget them." Then the audio flipped into clips. A captain laughing at a fundraiser, a clerk stamping resolved on a complaint, while an unseen hand slid a thick envelope across a desk, a nurse saying she was never told about a patient's return. Each clip was small. Their accumulation felt like rainfall against a window pane that had long been assumed unbreakable. Phones in the station buzzed in unison. Outside, fingers tapped and uploaded. The clip was live across channels before the captain had finished his sentence. The precinct's PR officer swore into the phone and then put it down because language had failed him. Officers who had hidden behind procedure now felt the heat of being watched by millions. Someone in the back gagged at the realization that the paperwork they'd filed and forgotten could now be replayed to relatives who had been told nothing. Captain Harrow went white. He reached for the radio, and his voice came out clipped, brittle with the need for control. "Lockdown," he ordered. "Nobody leaves. Call Internal Affairs." His orders had the hollow ring of ritual. He did not know whose hand had moved the pieces, only that the board had shifted. Joker watched the panic like a man watching shadows rearrange. He had never wanted spectacle for spectacle's sake. He wanted consequences. "When you hide a wound long enough," he told Mara, who stood at the bars as pale as sheet music, "it becomes a scar that keeps hurting everyone who touches it." She stared at him like someone trying to reconcile two impossible faces, a criminal and a mourner. Mara's hands trembled with the evidence he had given her. She could hand it to Internal Affairs and watch the bureaucracies digest it into paper and patience. Or she could do something unorthodox. She could make the truth unavoidable. Her training argued for chain of custody and procedure. Her conscience argued for the family of a girl who had no more advocates. She stepped into the corridor, past the officers who now whispered when they thought no one could hear, and told the sergeant to broadcast the files to the city's public channel under a whistleblower clause she'd been taught to use only in emergency. The sergeant blinked and complied, fingers betraying his face by how fast they moved. Harrow realized too late that the station systems had been seeded the night before. Subtle code embedded in a coffee-stained laptop returned to the evidence room after hours. The laptop had been flagged for cleanup but not erased, a negligence that now unspooled like thread. Whoever had placed it knew how information liked to be free. Whoever had placed it also knew exactly when the station would be looking the other way.
"You used the slap!"
Harrow spat as he approached the cell, voice low, dangerous. "You made me look. You made me human." Joker's smile was a small, cold thing. "You made yourself worse," he said. "You made the station believe its own narrative about protection. You sell safety to people who pay for it and leave the rest to rot. I simply applied some pressure and watched the rot show." Harrow lunged. Years of command taught him to close space quickly. Fists and rage were old tools for an old man. There was a scuffle, a shoving match that sent papers flying and phones skittering like stunned birds. In that moment, when Harrow's hand reached for a gun at his hip, Mara didn't think of laws. She thought of the girl's mother who'd called and cried and been routed into silence. She thought of the ledger of names and the way lines had been moved so people disappeared. "Stop!" Mara yelled. Her voice was not the tentative thing it had been earlier. It was a lever. Harrow froze, breathing hard, his hand hovering near his holster. The room smelled like metal and coffee, and 1,000 small hypocrisies. Mara stepped forward and, without thinking of promotions or accusations, unfastened the handcuffs from Joker's wrists and handed them to Harrow like a question. "You want him cuffed?" she asked, and there was no triumph in her voice, only a tiredness that could pass for sorrow. Harrow hesitated, then took them, and in doing so revealed himself. He could not arrest a man whose every move was now public, and who had already forced the precinct to confess. He could only try to salvage the parts of his career that hadn't yet been burned. The officers around them looked between the two like people watching a tide come in. Outside, the city responded. Protesters gathered at the station steps not because they loved Joker, but because they had been shown that the things they were told were private were actually public property. Journalists camped outside. Victims' families filed into the lobby, clutching photos like talismans. The station had been turned into a mirror the city couldn't look away from. Joker walked out of the cell unrestrained, not because he had been let go, but because the world no longer needed him in chains. The evidence was free, the names were said aloud, and that, for a moment, was enough to scramble the map of who owed what to whom.
He paused at the top of the steps and took off his glove, palm open like an offering. A child in the crowd, a boy with a face half curious, half awed, shouted, "Are you going to hurt them?" Joker looked down at the small, earnest face, and for the first time in a long while, the man's jaw softened. "No," he said quietly. "I hurt the silence." He pressed his gloved hand to his cheek, as if feeling the bruise through paint. Then, with a deliberate, almost ceremonial calm, he folded a small slip of paper, one of the many names that had not yet been made public, and laid it into the palm of the boy.
"Keep it," he told him. "Remember it."
The boy took it like a relic. The crowd inhaled. Mara watched Joker walk away into a city that would now forever know what the station had tried to hide. She wanted to arrest him, to bring him to book, to make the law tidy again. But the law was messy, and sometimes the only thing that could bend it back toward justice was a kind of beautiful, terrible noise. As Joker disappeared into the alleys that had raised him, his voice, not loud but precise, reached Mara one last time. "Tell me," he said, "when they ask you what you saw, say it plainly. If you lie, you'll have to live with the truth you hid." She did not answer. She only watched the boy open the paper and look at the name, eyes wide with a grown-up understanding of how small acts could carry enormous weight. The twist that would haunt the city for years was not the files or the arrest. It was that they had all forgotten how to feel scandal until someone showed them their own reflection bleeding. Joker became an anomaly, then an idea. A man who had made the corrupt reveal themselves and then walked off with the chaos like applause. If you felt that sting, that mixture of anger and strange sympathy, hit the same place as the first slap, hit subscribe, and join us for more stories that lean into the dark and ask how far someone will go for truth. We drop new episodes, raw, cinematic, and uncomfortably real. So don't miss the next one.